When people think about the Allied victory in World War II, they often focus on the major battlefronts and the largest powers: the Eastern Front, the Normandy landings, the industrial might of the United States, or the endurance of Britain during its darkest hours. Canada, by contrast, is frequently remembered as a loyal contributor, present, committed, but peripheral. Canadian forces fought bravely overseas, yet geographically far from home, and Canada itself was never invaded or bombed on the scale endured by others. This raises a reasonable and historically important question. Why was Canada critical to Allied victory despite fighting far from home? To answer that question meaningfully, we must move beyond battlefield narratives and adopt a broader analytical lens. The Second World War was not decided solely by tactical brilliance or individual campaigns. It was a prolonged, industrialized coalition war in which victory depended on the ability to sustain effort over time. Production, logistics, training, coordination, and political stability mattered as much as, often more than, dramatic engagements. In such a war, contributions that appear indirect or unglamorous can become decisive. This analysis therefore uses a why and how framework. The why asks why Canada's role became indispensable to the Allied war effort at a systemic level. The Chow W examines how Canada's institutions, geography, and decisions translated potential into practical outcomes. Together, these questions allow us to see Canada not as a secondary participant, but as a structural enabler of Allied success. The core argument of this series is straightforward, but often overlooked. Canada was critical to Allied victory because World War II was a coalition war that required secure depth, sustained industrial output, reliable logistics, and large-scale training capacity. And Canada provided all of these at a moment when they were urgently needed and not easily replaceable. Canada did not win the war alone, nor did it dominate strategic decision-making. Instead, it performed a role that modern military historians increasingly recognize as decisive. It functioned as a secure, scalable, and politically stable rear area for the Allied coalition. In a war where Britain was under direct threat, much of Europe was occupied, and the United States was still mobilizing, Canada offered something rare: safe capacity with immediate access to the Atlantic world. This was not accidental. It emerged from Canada's geography, its political relationship within the British Commonwealth, its economic structure, and its willingness to reorganize itself for total war. These factors combined to make Canada uniquely valuable during the critical early and middle phases of the conflict. Before proceeding further, it is important to clarify the boundaries of this discussion. This analysis is not an argument that Canada was the hidden winner of the war, or that its role has been deliberately minimized. Historical scholarship has long acknowledged Canada's contributions, though often in fragmented ways. Naval history here, industrial production there, training programs elsewhere. What is less common is an integrated explanation of why these contributions mattered strategically. This analysis also avoids nationalist framing. It does not claim moral superiority, exceptional virtue, or unique heroism. Canada's experience is examined not to elevate one nation above others, but to illustrate how coalition warfare rewards certain structural advantages and institutional choices. Finally, this is not a combat narrative. There will be no first-person battlefield storytelling or dramatic recreations of individual engagements. The focus remains on systems, decisions, and outcomes. At first glance, Canada's distance from the main theaters of war might seem to reduce its relevance. After all, the decisive battles were fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, not on Canadian soil. Yet this very distance became one of Canada's most important strategic assets. Modern war punishes exposed infrastructure. Factories under bombardment cannot produce reliably. Training bases under threat cannot operate at scale. Ports that are congested or vulnerable slow the entire war effort. In contrast, a nation that is geographically secure can become a reservoir of capacity, absorbing pressure that frontline states cannot. Canada occupied precisely this position. It was close enough to Europe to matter operationally, yet far enough from enemy reach to remain secure. Its Atlantic coastline connected it directly to Britain, while its vast interior offered space for industry and training on a scale unavailable in embattled regions. In coalition terms, Canada provided depth, the ability to sustain, repair, replace, and expand the war effort over time. One of the quiet ironies of World War II is that many of its most decisive contributions were the least visible. Convoys arriving on schedule, aircrew trained to standard, ships repaired quickly, supplies moving without interruption. These do not make for dramatic headlines, but they shape strategic reality. A coalition that can do these things consistently will outlast one that cannot. Canada's importance lies precisely here. Its value was cumulative rather than spectacular. Each additional month of secure production, each training cohort completed, each convoy supported reduced Allied risk and expanded Allied options. Over time, these small advantages compounded into strategic dominance. To understand why Canada became critical to Allied victory, it is first necessary to understand the strategic crisis that defined the opening phase of World War II. This was not merely a military emergency. It was a structural one. Between 1939 and 1941, the Allies faced a fundamental problem that historians often summarize with a single word: depth. They lacked it, and without depth, even the most determined resistance risks eventual collapse. When war began in September 1939, Allied planners did not yet grasp how quickly the European balance would break. The assumption, shared widely in London and Paris, was that a long war of attrition would unfold, similar in tempo to the First World War. Industrial capacity, financial endurance, and access to global resources would determine the outcome. In theory, this favored the Allies. In practice, the collapse of France in the summer of 1940 shattered those assumptions almost overnight. With France defeated and much of Western Europe under German control, Britain found itself isolated as the only major Allied power still actively resisting Germany in Europe. The British Army had escaped destruction at Dunkirk, but it had done so by abandoning enormous quantities of equipment. Britain retained political will, naval tradition, and imperial connections, but it was suddenly exposed. Its industrial centers, ports, and population were within reach of German air power, and its survival depended on uninterrupted overseas supply. This was the moment when the Allied depth problem became acute. Modern industrial war requires more than courage and strategy. It requires secure space in which to produce weapons, train personnel, repair damage, and recover from setbacks. Britain, as an island under air and submarine threat, had limited room to absorb sustained pressure. Every factory damaged, every convoy lost, every training base disrupted carried outsized consequences. Compounding this vulnerability was the reality that the United States, though increasingly supportive, was not yet a fully mobilized belligerent. American industrial potential was immense, but in 1940 to 1941, it remained largely latent. Domestic political constraints, legislative limits, and the sheer time required to convert peacetime industry into wartime production meant that the United States could not immediately serve as Britain's industrial and logistical rear area. Aid flowed through programs like Lend-Lease, but capacity expansion takes time, and time was precisely what Britain lacked. In this context, it is important to emphasize that strategic importance is often temporal. A contribution that becomes decisive in 1940 or 1941 may not appear as dramatic when viewed from the perspective of 1944 or 1945, after American mobilization reached full scale. Canada's critical role must therefore be understood within this narrow but decisive window, when Allied survival was uncertain and substitutes were limited. Other parts of the British Commonwealth could not easily fill this gap. Australia and New Zealand were geographically distant from the European theater, with long and vulnerable supply lines. India possessed manpower, but faced its own political and industrial constraints. Much of continental Europe was either occupied or under threat. What the Allies needed was a partner that combined industrial potential, political reliability, geographic security, and proximity to the North Atlantic supply routes. This is where Canada entered the strategic equation, not as an afterthought, but as a solution to a specific and urgent problem. Canada, in 1939, was not yet the industrial power it would become by 1945. Its population was modest, its military relatively small, and its economy still heavily oriented towards civilian production and resource extraction. Yet Canada possessed three attributes that were unusually valuable in the early war years. First, Canada was secure. Unlike Britain, it was beyond the reach of German bombers. Unlike much of Europe, it faced no immediate threat of occupation. This security allowed factories, shipyards, ports, and training facilities to operate without constant disruption. In an era when bombing campaigns sought to paralyze enemy economies, this mattered enormously. Second, Canada was connected. Its Atlantic ports linked directly to Britain and increasingly to the broader Allied logistics network. Unlike the United States, which still faced political constraints on its involvement, Canada was already at war and fully committed. Goods, personnel, and training outputs could move eastward without the diplomatic or legal friction that sometimes slowed American assistance in the early period. Third, Canada was institutionally aligned. As a self-governing member of the British Commonwealth, Canada shared administrative practices, military doctrine, and political assumptions with Britain. This reduced friction in coordination and planning. In coalition warfare, compatibility can be as important as capacity. The ability to integrate systems quickly without extensive retraining or procedural reinvention, accelerates effectiveness. The significance of these factors becomes clearer when we consider the nature of the German threat in 1940-1941. Germany did not need to invade Britain immediately to win the war. It needed only to sever Britain's access to food, fuel, and raw materials long enough to force political capitulation or military exhaustion. Submarines, surface raiders, and air attacks all served this purpose. Britain's margin for error was thin. Canada helped widen that margin, not through dramatic victories, but by making collapse less likely. Every ton of material shipped, every ship repaired, every crew trained in relative safety reduced Britain's vulnerability and increased its resilience. In effect, Canada became an extension of Britain's strategic depth, an external rear area that Germany could not easily reach. It is also worth noting what Canada's role did not depend on. It did not require exceptional military genius or revolutionary technology. It depended on reliability, scale, and endurance. These qualities are often undervalued in popular history, yet they are central to how large wars are actually won. By late 1941, the strategic landscape began to shift. The United States entered the war directly, and American industrial mobilization accelerated at a pace unmatched in history. The Soviet Union absorbed and reversed the main weight of the German army on the Eastern Front. In this later phase, Canada's role is sometimes perceived as diminished by comparison. Yet this perception overlooks the fact that the Allies reached that later phase only because they survived the earlier one. Canada mattered most when failure was still a real possibility. This early war context sets the stage for the analytical core of the argument. Canada's contribution was not accidental, symbolic, or merely proportional. It answered a specific Allied need at a critical moment. The next step is to examine why Canada, rather than other potential partners, was uniquely positioned to meet that need. By the early 1940s, the Allied coalition faced a stark reality. Survival and eventual victory would depend less on short-term battlefield success than on the ability to sustain a complex war system over time. This is the context in which Canada's importance must be understood. The central why question is not why Canada participated. Many nations did. But why Canada became indispensable to Allied victory during the most fragile phase of the war. The answer lies in a convergence of structural factors that few other countries could replicate simultaneously. The first and most fundamental reason was secure industrial capacity. Modern total war punishes vulnerability. Factories under air attack do not simply produce less, they produce unpredictably. Supply chains fracture, skilled workers are displaced, and planning horizons shorten. Britain, though industrially sophisticated, operated under constant threat from German bombing. Even when output remained high, the uncertainty imposed real strategic costs. Canada, by contrast, offered industrial capacity that was not only expandable, but also secure. Its factories could run continuously, schedules could be honored, and long-term contracts could be fulfilled without the constant fear of interruption. In a war, defined by production curves and delivery timelines, this reliability mattered as much as sheer volume. Security alone, however, does not explain indispensability. The second key reason was geographic advantage combined with Atlantic proximity. Canada was uniquely positioned between North America and Europe, directly facing the North Atlantic, the most important logistical corridor of the war for the Western Allies. This proximity reduced transit times, simplified convoy cycles, and allowed for faster feedback between production, shipment, and operational use. In practical terms, it meant that goods produced in Canada could reach Britain more quickly and with fewer points of failure than goods shipped from deeper inland or from more distant parts of the Commonwealth. Geography here functioned as a force multiplier. A third reason lies in coalition compatibility, an often underappreciated factor in alliance warfare. The Allies were not a single unified state. They were a coalition of sovereign nations with different doctrines, administrative cultures, and political priorities. Such coalitions are inherently vulnerable to friction, delays, misunderstandings, duplicated effort, and conflicting standards. Canada's institutional alignment with Britain reduced these frictions. Shared legal traditions, administrative practices, military doctrine, and language allowed Canadian systems to integrate smoothly into the broader Allied framework. This compatibility shortened learning curves and accelerated coordination at precisely the moment when speed was essential. Equally important was political reliability. Sustaining a long war requires more than resources. It requires stable governance, capable of mobilizing society without fracturing it. Canada's political system, while not without internal tensions, proved resilient. It allowed for large-scale mobilization, industrial conversion, and overseas commitment while maintaining democratic legitimacy. This mattered strategically because unpredictability in domestic politics translates into unpredictability in war planning. Allies need to know that promised production will materialize, that training programs will continue, and that commitments will not be abruptly reversed. Canada's political stability made it a trustworthy partner in long-term planning. Another crucial factor was timing and substitutability. In theory, the United States could have replaced Canada's industrial and logistical role. In practice, during the critical period between 1940 and 1942, it could not fully do so. American industry was in the process of mobilization, not yet operating at wartime peak. Political and legal constraints still shape the pace and scope of involvement. Canada, already at war and fully committed, filled a gap that existed only for a limited but decisive window. Indispensability, in this sense, was not permanent. It was temporal. Canada mattered most when alternatives were not yet fully available. This point is essential for avoiding exaggerated claims. Canada's role did not rest on being irreplaceable forever. It rested on being irreplaceable when it counted. Coalition wars are dynamic, and the relative weight of contributors shifts over time. Canada's strategic value peaked during the period when Britain stood alone in Europe and before American mobilization reached maturity. Without Canada's contribution during this phase, the Allies would have faced higher risk, narrower options, and a much thinner margin for error. It is also important to distinguish indispensability from dominance. Canada did not dictate Allied strategy, nor did it overshadow larger powers. Its influence was structural, rather than directive. By expanding the coalition's capacity to endure, Canada enabled strategic choices that might otherwise have been impossible. In this sense, Canada shaped the conditions under which decisions were made, rather than the decisions themselves. This is a subtle but powerful form of influence, often invisible in traditional narratives focused on conferences and commanders. Another reason Canada became indispensable was in the nature of industrial learning and accumulation. War production systems do not achieve efficiency overnight. They improve through iteration, standardization, and experience. Canada's early mobilization allowed it to climb this learning curve sooner than many others. By the time Allied operations expanded in scale, Canadian systems were already mature, factories optimized, supply chains stabilized, and administrative procedures refined. This early start produced cumulative benefits that extended throughout the war. Finally, Canada's role must be understood in relation to risk distribution within the coalition. One of the central challenges of alliance warfare is spreading risk in a way that prevents catastrophic failure. By hosting production, training, and logistical functions beyond the reach of enemy attack, Canada reduced the concentration of risk in Britain alone. This diversification of risk enhanced overall Allied resilience. Even when losses occurred at sea, in the air, or on land, the system as a whole remained functional. Taken together, these factors explain why Canada was not merely helpful, but strategically critical. Secure industrial capacity, geographic advantage, coalition compatibility, political reliability, timely availability, early learning, and risk distribution formed a constellation of advantages that few nations could replicate simultaneously. Canada did not need to fight on its own soil to matter decisively. In a war where endurance was the ultimate weapon, Canada strengthened the Allied capacity to endure. Having established why Canada became indispensable, the analysis now turns to the practical dimension. Structural advantages do not automatically translate into results. They must be activated through institutions, policies, and systems capable of managing complexity at scale. Understanding why Canada mattered strategically is only half the explanation. Structural advantages, geography, security, political alignment, do not automatically produce results. They must be converted into output through institutions capable of organizing people, resources, and decisions at scale. The crucial how question, therefore, is how Canada transformed itself from a mid-sized peacetime economy into a reliable wartime system, without collapsing under the social, political, and administrative strain that total war inevitably creates. The central dilemma Canada faced was one common to all democratic states in wartime: how to mobilize society intensely enough to meet military demands while preserving the legitimacy and stability required to sustain that mobilization over several years. Authoritarian systems can impose rapid change through coercion. Democratic systems must rely on coordination, persuasion, and institutional credibility. Canada's success lay not in avoiding this dilemma, but in managing it deliberately. At the heart of Canada's transformation was the rapid expansion of state coordination, rather than outright state control. The federal government did not attempt to nationalize the entire economy or replace private industry. Instead, it focused on steering production through contracts, priorities, and standards. This approach preserved industrial incentives while aligning output with military needs. Factories remained privately operated, but what they produced, in what quantity, and on what timeline increasingly reflected national war priorities. This system depended on predictability. War production is less about spectacular bursts of output than about consistent delivery over time. Canadian planners understood that a rifle delivered late, a shipyard idle due to missing components, or a rail bottleneck could have cascading effects far beyond the factory floor. As a result, administrative attention focused heavily on coordination across supply chains, linking raw materials, manufacturing, transportation, and export in a continuous loop. Transportation infrastructure became a strategic asset. Canada's rail networks were not merely economic conveniences. They were the arteries through which the war economy flowed. Coal, steel, grain, manufactured goods, and personnel all depended on reliable rail movement from inland regions to Atlantic ports. Wartime administration therefore prioritized maintenance, scheduling discipline, and traffic deconfliction. Efficiency here did not require innovation so much as relentless attention to detail. Trains arriving on time mattered more than bold experiments. Ports, too, were treated as components of a system rather than isolated facilities. Throughput, the speed with which ships could be loaded, unloaded, repaired, and turned around, became a key performance metric. Congestion was not a local inconvenience. It was a strategic vulnerability. Canadian port management focused on minimizing delays, standardizing procedures, and integrating port operations with rail schedules. These measures rarely attract public attention, but they directly shaped the Allied ability to move material across the Atlantic. Industrial conversion posed another challenge. Factories designed for civilian goods had to be retooled for military production, often under tight timelines. This required not only new machinery, but also new skills, quality controls, and inspection regimes. Canada's approach emphasized gradual but continuous improvement. Initial output was sometimes imperfect, but learning was rapid. Standardization reduced errors, and feedback loops between producers and military users improved reliability over time. The goal was not perfection at the outset, but dependable improvement. Labor posed a further test of social cohesion. Total war places immense demands on the workforce, and Canada was no exception. Workers were asked to accept longer hours, new tasks, and disruptions to normal life. The government responded not primarily with coercion, but with negotiation and incentives. Wage controls, labor agreements, and appeals to shared responsibility helped maintain industrial peace. Strikes and disputes did occur, but they did not cripple production. This relative stability was itself a strategic achievement. Equally important was the management of regional and linguistic diversity. Canada's war effort unfolded within a society marked by distinct regional identities and political sensitivities. Mobilization policies had to account for these realities to avoid backlash that could undermine legitimacy. The federal government's cautious handling of contentious issues, particularly those related to compulsory service, reflected an understanding that a divided home front could erode industrial output just as surely as enemy action. Stability was not an abstract political goal. It was an economic and strategic necessity. Administrative capacity functioned as a force multiplier throughout this process. Effective war economies require civil servants who can plan, monitor, and adapt. Canada invested heavily in expanding and professionalizing its wartime bureaucracy. Data collection, reporting systems, and interdepartmental coordination improved steadily. This allowed planners to identify bottlenecks early and reallocate resources before problems became crises. In coalition warfare, such reliability builds trust. Allies plan differently when they know that promised deliveries are likely to arrive. One of the less visible but most important aspects of Canada's mobilization was its emphasis on integration rather than isolation. Canadian production was not designed to serve Canada alone. It was embedded within Allied planning frameworks. Standards were harmonized where possible, documentation shared, and production schedules coordinated with overseas needs. This reduced duplication and waste, enabling the coalition to operate as a more unified system. Crucially, Canada's war economy was not built overnight. It evolved through incremental adaptation. Early inefficiencies were corrected, procedures refined, and capacities expanded. This evolutionary approach proved more sustainable than sudden, disruptive overhauls. By maintaining continuity in institutions and personnel, Canada preserved institutional memory and organizational learning, assets that paid dividends as the war intensified. By the mid-war period, Canada had become a predictable node within the Allied system. Predictability may sound uninspiring, but in wartime it is invaluable. Commanders and planners could factor Canadian output into long-term plans with confidence. This reduced uncertainty and expanded strategic choice. In a conflict where surprise was often deadly, reliability became a quiet form of power. The significance of this domestic transformation becomes most apparent when these systems are placed under maximum stress. Industrial coordination and administrative efficiency matter little in isolation. They matter when lives depend on uninterrupted flow. Nowhere was this stress test more severe than on the Atlantic lifeline connecting North America to Europe. If Canada's wartime economy was the engine of its contribution, then the Atlantic was the transmission system through which that power reached the battlefield. The struggle to keep sea lanes open between North America and Europe, commonly known as the Battle of the Atlantic, was not a single battle, but a prolonged contest of systems. It tested whether the Allies could move enough material, often enough, for long enough to sustain resistance and eventually enable offensive operations. Canada's critical role in this contest lay not in dramatic naval victories, but in making the Atlantic system workable under relentless pressure. To understand this role properly, the Atlantic must be reframed. Popular accounts often emphasize submarine duels and individual sinkings. But from a strategic perspective, the Atlantic was a logistics problem. Britain's survival depended on tonnage delivered, not on enemy ships destroyed. Food, fuel, raw materials, and finished weapons had to arrive continuously. Any sustained disruption risked not only military defeat, but civilian collapse. In this context, success was measured in schedules kept, ships repaired, convoys formed, and cargo unloaded, not in headlines. Canada entered this struggle with two decisive advantages: geography and scalability. Its Atlantic coastline placed it closer to Britain than most of North America, shortening convoy routes and reducing exposure time to enemy attack. Equally important, Canada could expand its maritime infrastructure rapidly. Ports, shipyards, repair facilities, and administrative offices grew in capacity as the war intensified, transforming Canada from a peripheral maritime actor into a central logistical hub. Ports were the first critical node. Eastern Canadian ports became staging points where cargo, personnel, and escort vessels converged. Managing these ports required more than dock workers and cranes. It required systems thinking. Congestion could be as dangerous as enemy action. Ships waiting too long in port were vulnerable, and delays disrupted convoy schedules downstream. Canadian authorities, therefore, emphasized throughput, how quickly ships could be loaded, unloaded, repaired, and sent back to sea. Procedures were standardized, rail schedules synchronized, and port operations coordinated closely with naval planners. The goal was not perfection, but flow. Escort forces formed the second pillar of Canada's Atlantic role. While early in the war, Canadian naval capabilities were limited, growth was rapid. More important than the raw number of ships was the development of persistence. Convoy protection required vessels that could remain at sea, integrate into multinational formations, and operate continuously rather than episodically. Success was incremental. Tactics evolved, communications improved, and coordination with air patrols gradually increased. This was not a story of sudden mastery, but of learning under pressure. Crucially, Canadian escort operations were judged by outcomes rather than spectacle. The measure of effectiveness was cargo delivered, not enemy losses inflicted. This perspective shaped operational priorities. Escorts focused on deterrence, protection, and disruption of attacks rather than aggressive pursuit that might leave convoys exposed. Such restraint rarely produces dramatic narratives, but it preserves the system. In a war of endurance, preserving the system was the higher objective. Ship repair and maintenance constituted another less visible but vital contribution. Warships and merchant vessels alike require constant upkeep. Damage, wear, and mechanical failure can remove ships from service just as effectively as enemy action. Canada's shipyards and repair facilities extended the operational life of vessels, reducing the demand for new construction and accelerating return to service. A repaired ship rejoining a convoy often mattered more than a newly built one months away from deployment. In this sense, repair capacity functioned as hidden tonnage. Administration and coordination tied these elements together. The Atlantic War involved multiple Allied navies, merchant fleets, and command structures. Without effective coordination, even abundant resources could be wasted. Canada contributed by hosting and participating in decentralized command arrangements that reduced delays and improved responsiveness. Information flowed more quickly between ports, escorts, and convoy planners. This decentralization allowed local conditions to shape decisions without losing strategic coherence. It was a pragmatic solution to a complex problem. Canada's role also helped redistribute risk within the Allied system. By shifting convoy assembly, escort coordination, and repair work westward, some pressure was relieved from Britain's overstretched ports and shipyards. This redistribution did not eliminate risk, but it reduced the likelihood of catastrophic bottlenecks. In systems terms, Canada increased redundancy. If one node was damaged or overloaded, others could compensate. Redundancy is rarely efficient in peacetime, but in wartime, it is essential. As the war progressed, the Atlantic balance gradually shifted in the Allies' favor. Improved escort coverage, better coordination, and growing industrial output reduced losses and stabilized supply lines. It would be misleading to attribute this shift to any single country. It was a coalition achievement, yet Canada's contribution was foundational. By making the Atlantic system more resilient, Canada helped ensure that Allied strength could accumulate rather than dissipate. It is worth emphasizing that this contribution was cumulative. Individual convoys rarely decided the war, but each successful crossing reinforced the next. Every uninterrupted supply cycle strengthened Britain's capacity to fight, train, and plan. Over time, this reliability enabled the transition from defensive survival to offensive preparation. The Atlantic lifeline did not merely sustain the Allies, it enabled their strategic evolution. By the time Allied offensives expanded in scope, the Atlantic had become a managed problem rather than an existential crisis. This transition did not occur spontaneously. It was the result of sustained attention to logistics, administration, and coordination, areas in which Canada played a central role. In doing so, Canada demonstrated a form of strategic contribution that rarely attracts popular attention, but decisively shapes outcomes. Yet material flow alone does not win wars. Ships, fuel, and weapons require skilled personnel to use them effectively. The Atlantic system depended not only on hardware, but on trained human capital. Sailors, aircrew, technicians, and specialists capable of operating within a complex coalition framework. Industrial output and logistical flow are necessary conditions for victory in modern war, but they are not sufficient. Weapons, ships, and aircraft only become effective when operated by trained personnel who can function within complex organizations under stress. One of the less visible yet strategically decisive ways Canada contributed to Allied victory in World War II was by becoming a large-scale producer of human capital. Trained aircrew, sailors, technicians, and specialists capable of operating within a multinational war system. This role was not incidental. It was the product of deliberate choices that leveraged Canada's geography, security, and institutional compatibility. The human capital challenge of total war is often underestimated. Modern weapon systems are complex, and their effectiveness depends on competence, coordination, and discipline. Training takes time, space, and stability. Three things that frontline nations often lack. Britain, for example, faced constant pressure on its training infrastructure. Airfields and ports were vulnerable to attack, and operational demands competed directly with training needs. Every aircraft used for training was one less available for combat. Every base devoted to instruction was one less available for defense. Under such conditions, expanding training capacity safely and consistently was extraordinarily difficult. Canada offered a solution. Its vast territory provided space for training on a scale impossible in embattled Europe. Its relative security ensured continuity. Training programs could operate without interruption from enemy action, allowing standardized curricula to be delivered reliably. Weather and terrain varied enough to prepare personnel for diverse operational environments, while the absence of immediate threat reduced the pressure to divert resources away from training at critical moments. This geographic advantage was matched by institutional alignment. As a member of the British Commonwealth, Canada shared military traditions, administrative practices, and professional norms with Britain and other allied partners. This compatibility mattered greatly in training. Procedures, terminology, and command relationships could be taught in a way that translated directly to operational units overseas. Trainees did not need to unlearn habits or adapt to unfamiliar systems upon deployment in coalition warfare. Such friction reduction accelerates effectiveness and reduces avoidable losses. Training at scale, however, requires more than space and compatibility. It requires organization. Canada approached training as an industrial process, applying principles of standardization, throughput, and quality control. Curricula were designed to produce consistent outcomes rather than exceptional individuals. Instructors were trained systematically, creating a multiplier effect that expanded capacity without sacrificing standards. Facilities were distributed across the country, reducing bottlenecks and increasing resilience. If one site faced delays or shortages, others could compensate. This system emphasized predictability. Trainees progressed through clearly defined stages, allowing planners to forecast when new personnel would become available. Such predictability is invaluable in war planning. Commanders can align operational schedules with personnel availability, reducing the risk of understrength units or rushed preparation. Canada's training pipelines thus contributed not only manpower but planning confidence. The benefits of this approach extended beyond quantity. Quality improved over time. As instructors gained experience and feedback from operational theaters was incorporated into curricula, training evolved. Mistakes were corrected, procedures refined, and best practices disseminated across the system. This iterative learning process mirrored the industrial learning seen in Canada's factories and shipyards. Early inefficiencies were not hidden or denied. They were addressed methodically. Over time, the training system became more effective and more reliable. Canada's training role also strengthened coalition cohesion. Personnel trained in Canada often came from multiple allied nations, particularly within the Commonwealth. Training together fostered shared professional norms and mutual familiarity. This social dimension of training is difficult to quantify, yet it has real operational effects. Units that share expectations about discipline, communication, and procedure cooperate more smoothly under pressure. In a war where coordination across national lines was unavoidable, such shared norms reduced friction at the point of contact. Another strategic benefit lay in risk distribution. By relocating large portions of training away from vulnerable frontline regions, the Allies reduced the concentration of risk. Losses to enemy action or disruption in one area did not paralyze the entire training system. Canada functioned as a reserve of competence, a place where the coalition could replenish itself even during periods of intense operational strain elsewhere. This redundancy enhanced overall resilience. It is important to note that Canada's training contribution did not imply isolation from the war's realities. Feedback loops connected training establishments to operational units. Lessons learned overseas were transmitted back to instructors, who adjusted programs accordingly. This ensured that training remained relevant rather than doctrinally stagnant. The system was not static. It adapted continuously to the evolving demands of the conflict. From a strategic perspective, the impact of this human capital production was cumulative. Each cohort of trained personnel reduced the strain on existing units, stabilized replacement flows, and allowed for expansion rather than mere survival. Over time, this accumulation of competence increased Allied operational flexibility. Commanders could contemplate larger, more complex operations because they could rely on a steady supply of trained personnel to support them. Canada's contribution in this domain is often overshadowed by more visible forms of participation. Training does not produce dramatic footage or singular moments of triumph. Its effects are distributed, indirect, and incremental. Yet in a war of endurance, such contributions are decisive. A coalition that can consistently replace losses with trained personnel maintains momentum, one that cannot gradually erodes. By the later stages of the war, the Allied system possessed a depth of skill and experience that far exceeded that of its opponents. This imbalance did not arise spontaneously. It was built over years through deliberate investment in training infrastructure and institutional learning. Canada's secure environment, organizational capacity, and coalition alignment made it a central pillar of that effort. As with Canada's industrial and logistical contributions, the significance of its training role lies less in any single achievement than in its cumulative effect. It expanded Allied endurance, reduced operational risk, and enabled strategic choice. In doing so, Canada reinforced the underlying conditions necessary for victory rather than seeking recognition through isolated feats. The final step in this analysis is to examine what these contributions ultimately produced. How did Canada's systemic role shape wartime outcomes, and what consequences did it have for Canada's position in the post-war world? Addressing these questions allows us to connect mechanisms to results and extract broader strategic lessons. By 1945, Allied victory in World War II appeared overwhelming. The scale of industrial output, the reach of Allied forces, and the collapse of Axis resistance created a sense of inevitability. Yet inevitability is a retrospective illusion. At multiple points between 1939 and 1942, Allied defeat was not only possible, but plausible. The outcome was decided not by a single turning point, but by whether the Allied system could endure long enough to mobilize its advantages fully. Canada's contribution mattered because it increased the probability of endurance, and endurance, in this war, was decisive. To understand the significance of Canada's role, it is useful to think in terms of systemic causation rather than heroic causation. Canada did not win the war by delivering a decisive blow. Instead, it altered the conditions under which blows could be delivered repeatedly and sustainably. It reduced the risk of systemic failure at moments when the margin for error was thin. This distinction is central to assessing outcomes honestly and without exaggeration. Consider the counterfactual. If Canada had not provided safe industrial capacity, Atlantic infrastructure, training depth, and administrative reliability, the Allied war effort would not necessarily have collapsed outright. More likely, it would have weakened incrementally. Production delays would have compounded. Shipping losses would have taken longer to replace. Training pipelines would have struggled to keep pace with attrition. Strategic options would have narrowed, not because of a single disaster, but because cumulative strain would have eroded flexibility. Modern wars of endurance are lost this way. They are not usually decided by one catastrophic event, but by a gradual imbalance between demands and capacity. Canada's role consistently pushed that balance in the Allies' favor. It absorbed stress, industrial, logistical, and human, at times when other partners were operating at or beyond their limits. This systemic contribution also helps explain why Canada's wartime importance has often been underestimated. Systems that function well become invisible. When convoys arrive on schedule, attention shifts elsewhere. When trained personnel replace losses seamlessly, success is attributed to leadership or morale. When factories produce steadily, output becomes background noise. Only when systems fail do they attract notice, and by then, it is often too late. Canada helped ensure that failure did not arrive. The effects of this contribution were evident by the later stages of the war. Allied operations expanded dramatically in scale and complexity. Large amphibious assaults, sustained air campaigns, and multinational ground operations required not only material superiority, but organizational depth. The Allies could afford to absorb losses, adjust tactics, and continue operating because their underlying systems remained intact. Canada was one of the pillars supporting that integrity. Importantly, Canada emerged from the war without claiming primacy or dominance. It did not dictate post-war settlements, nor did it seek to convert wartime contributions into coercive power. Instead, Canada's influence took a different form, one rooted in credibility. Allies trusted Canada because it had proven reliable under pressure. That trust became a form of strategic capital in the post-war world. This shift marked Canada's transition from a secondary power to a recognized middle power with disproportionate influence in certain domains. Canada's voice carried weight in multilateral forums, not because it commanded vast forces, but because it was perceived as competent, disciplined, and committed to collective outcomes. These perceptions were not abstract. They were grounded in wartime experience. The war also shaped Canada's strategic culture. Having seen how victory depended on coordination, standardization, and institutional resilience, Canada emerged with a strong preference for multilateral solutions. Support for international institutions was not merely ideological. It reflected a practical understanding that security in a complex world is best achieved through shared systems rather than unilateral action. Canada's later association with peacekeeping and alliance management can be traced directly to this experience. Peacekeeping required restraint, procedural discipline, and trust, qualities Canada had honed during the war. While peacekeeping differs fundamentally from total war, both rely on organizational competence more than dramatic force. Canada's wartime role prepared it well for such tasks. At the same time, it is essential to avoid romanticizing Canada's experience. The war imposed real costs. Mobilization strained society. Political compromises were made to preserve unity. Contributions were often taken for granted by larger allies. Recognition did not always match effort. These realities underscore a central lesson of systemic contribution. It often benefits the collective more than the contributor's immediate prestige. Yet this, too, had lasting implications. Canada learned that influence does not always align with visibility. It learned that sustaining systems can be more consequential than commanding attention. These lessons remain relevant in contemporary security environments where logistics, training, and coordination often matter more than headline-grabbing actions. From a broader analytical perspective, Canada's experience challenges simplistic measures of national power. Counting divisions, ships, or aircraft provides only a partial picture. The more revealing question is whether a state strengthens or weakens the systems it participates in. Canada strengthened the Allied system at a time when that system's survival was uncertain. This reframing also helps correct common misconceptions about distance and relevance. Fighting far from home does not imply marginal importance. In global conflicts, rear areas, training hubs, and logistical nodes can be as decisive as front lines. Canada's distance from the fighting was not a sign of detachment. It was a condition that enabled contribution. The enduring lesson is not that Canada was uniquely virtuous or uniquely capable. Rather, it is that Canada occupied a specific structural position and exploited it effectively. Geography, political choice, and institutional capacity aligned with the needs of a war defined by endurance. Canada recognized this alignment and acted accordingly. World War II was a collective achievement. No single nation secured victory alone. But collective achievements depend on certain roles being filled competently and consistently. Canada filled roles that were essential, difficult to replace, and poorly suited to nations under direct threat. That is why Canada mattered. Understanding this does not diminish the sacrifices of others. It clarifies the architecture of success. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by those who advance under fire, but by those who ensure that advance is possible, by producing, training, supplying, coordinating, and sustaining. Canada's contribution belongs firmly in that category. It was not spectacular. It was structural, and over time, it was decisive.